Rainstorms have a way of washing away the noise of the outside world, but they also drown out the sounds you actually need to hear. Tonight, we're diving into 3 true, chilling stories, from an intruder standing silently in a dark bedroom doorway, to an unhinged stalker pounding on a home office door, to a roadside motel that was never meant to have guests. Grab your headphones, lock your front door, and let's get into the stories. This happened back when I was about 14 years old. It was just my dad and me living in a pretty standard, quiet suburban neighborhood out in the Pacific Northwest. We had this typical 2-story house with creaky hardwood floors and a big, dark backyard. On this particular Tuesday, I stayed home sick from school with a nasty cold. My dad, of course, still had to go to work, so I ended up having the entire place to myself all day. Around 6 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from him checking in to see how I was feeling and letting me know that he was stuck working late at the plant. Honestly, that was pretty normal for us. Depending on the shift, he wouldn't make it through the front door until 2 or 3 in the morning. With his job, he didn't really have a choice, so I was used to being on my own at night. I heated up a couple of frozen Hot Pockets for dinner, crashed on the couch downstairs, and watched mindless TV until about 11:30. Eventually, I dragged myself upstairs, brushed my teeth, and crawled into bed. I scrolled through my phone for maybe 15 minutes before completely passing out. I woke up several hours later. I'd guess it was somewhere right around 2 a.m. You know that feeling when you're only half awake, where your brain is barely processing reality and your eyes are too heavy to open? That was me. I didn't move. I didn't lift my head off the pillow. Downstairs, I heard the familiar sound of a key sliding into the lock, the latch clicking, and the heavy front door pushing open. I didn't think anything of it. In my head, I just thought, good, Dad's finally home. I closed my eyes tighter, pulling the blanket up to my chin, trying to drift right back off to sleep. I listened to his footsteps pacing around on the first floor for a few minutes. Then I heard the faint groaning of the wooden stairs as he started making his way up to the second floor. The footsteps moved down the hallway and stopped right outside my bedroom door. After a second of silence, I heard the doorknob turn and my door gently cracked open. I didn't bother sitting up or saying anything. Whenever my dad got home late, he'd always crack my door open just to peek in and make sure I was alive and asleep. But after about 5 or 6 seconds of complete stillness, something felt off. I cracked my eyes open just a tiny bit. None of the hallway lights were on. The entire upstairs was pitch black, lit only by the faint, cold blue street lamp bleeding through my bedroom window blinds. Standing right in the frame of my doorway was the tall, dark silhouette of a man. He was just standing there, totally motionless. He was leaning forward slightly, peering through the dark, staring directly at my bed, as if he was studying my chest to see if I was actually breathing or just pretending to be asleep. My dad would check on me for maybe 2 seconds before pulling the door shut, but this figure stood there for what felt like an eternity. 10, 15 seconds of dead, heavy silence. Before I could fully shake off the sleep and sit up, the figure stepped back from the doorway, turned, and walked down the hall toward the master bedroom. And that was when a cold knot twisted in my stomach. My dad didn't close my door. He left it wide open like that. That tiny detail was the final straw that forced my adrenaline to spike and woke me up completely. I kicked the covers off, got out of bed, and quietly walked over to the open doorway. I leaned my head out and looked down the dark hallway. All the other doors along the hall were shut, except the master bedroom at the far end. Its door was wide open, swallowed by pitch-black darkness. No lights were on, no rustling of clothes, no sound of someone getting ready for bed. Complete, unnatural, dead air. Confused, slightly freaked out, and wanting to shut the world out, I pulled my bedroom door completely closed and turned back toward my nightstand to grab my phone. I unlocked the screen. The clock read 1:52 a.m. There were a couple of unread text messages from my dad. I tapped the screen and opened the thread. The first message was earlier, asking how my fever was doing, but the last text, sent at 1:40 a.m., barely 10 minutes ago, read, "Just clocked out and heading to my car now. Highways backed up with rain, so I'm probably about an hour away. Get some sleep, kiddo." My heart plummeted straight into my stomach. My dad worked an hour away. He wasn't home. Whoever was inside this house right now was not my dad. I stood frozen in the middle of my bedroom, gripping my phone with white knuckles, staring in absolute, suffocating terror at my closed bedroom door. And then I heard it. From deep inside the master bedroom down the hall, heavy footsteps started walking back out. I paralyzed like a deer in headlights. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. I couldn't even take a breath. The footsteps moved steadily down the hallway, closer and closer, until they stopped dead on the other side of my door. I knew what he was doing. He was standing there, staring at the closed wood, realizing that the door he had intentionally left open just 3 minutes ago was now shut tight. He knew I was awake. For 5 agonizing, endless seconds, nobody moved. I could practically feel his presence pressing through the thin, hollow wood, deciding whether to grab the knob, kick it open, and come inside. Suddenly, the floorboards shook. He didn't grab the handle. Instead, he bolted. I heard heavy boots sprinting down the hallway, thundering down the stairs, tearing across the hardwood floor downstairs, and the violent slam of the front door echoing through the empty house. The second I heard the downstairs door slam, survival instincts finally kicked in. I lunged at my door, locked it, shoved my desk chair under the knob, and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. I stayed crouched in the corner of my room, clutching a pair of heavy scissors, listening to the rain hit my window until 3 police cruisers pulled into the driveway with their lights flashing. The officers searched every single inch of the house, the crawl space, and the perimeter outside. The intruder was gone. The craziest part, nothing was stolen. My dad's expensive electronics downstairs hadn't been touched. No cash was missing. After talking through everything with the detectives and my dad, the general theory was chilling. Whoever broke in likely had a key or picked the lock, knew my dad's routine, and had come into the house to wait in ambush for him to return from his late shift. My dad insisted he had no idea who could have done it or why anyone would want to target him.
And because it was so dark upstairs and I assumed it was my dad, I never got a clear look at the guy's face, just that tall, featureless silhouette staring at me from the doorway. We packed up our lives and moved out of that house within the month. My dad ended up finding a day shift job so I wouldn't have to be left alone at night anymore. Over the years, nothing ever came of the investigation, but to this day, whenever I stay in an empty house and hear a door click in the dead of night, my blood runs cold, wondering who was really waiting in the dark on the other side of that door.
The next story. The night this happened, there was a nasty storm rolling through outside, and I was working from home at my overnight remote security job. Honestly, it was one of the most boring, low-maintenance gigs you could imagine. My entire job was just monitoring live security camera feeds and responding to occasional sensor alerts for a half-dozen corporate buildings scattered across the state. Because it was entirely remote, I just kicked back comfortably in my upstairs home office, set up my laptop, and keep an eye on things. 99% of the time, nothing ever happened, aside from the occasional raccoon tripping a motion sensor. Around 10 p.m., I headed up to my office, flipped open my laptop, and clocked in for the shift. Now, obviously, sitting in a dark room staring at empty parking lot feeds for 8 hours straight will drive you insane. So, to stay awake, I usually threw on YouTube videos or a movie on my second screen with my noise-canceling headphones. With Halloween just around the corner, I ironically decided to put on a horror movie that night. About halfway through the movie, right through the mix of the audio and my padded headset, I heard something weird. It sounded like a human voice calling out from somewhere nearby. Dip. I instantly pulled the headphones off and looked around the room. It was faint and muffled, and the downpour against the window panes was loud. But my gut told me that for me to hear it over the storm and my headset, whoever made that sound had to be standing practically right outside my house. I stood up, walked downstairs, and checked the ground floor windows. I peeked through the blinds into the street. The entire neighborhood was dead silent. No cars passing by, no headlights. Every house was pitch black, and not a single soul was out on the sidewalk. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just my brain playing tricks on me, or some muffled audio bleed from the movie. While I was downstairs, I brewed a fresh cup of coffee to wake myself up and headed back up to my desk. I sat down, set my mug on the coaster, and before I could even slide the headset back over my ears, I heard it again. This time, it sounded close, uncomfortably close, like inside the house close. It was unmistakably a man's voice. The only reason I hesitated to completely panic was that even though it was loud, it still sounded strangely muffled, like someone talking through a barrier. I stepped out into the dark hallway and called down toward the stairs. "Hello? Is someone there?" Nothing, just the drone of the rain.
The storm outside made the whole house feel 10 times creepier, because the roar of the wind covered up any subtle floorboard creaks or movement. I crept down the stairs to the first floor. As soon as I walked into the living room, I spotted it. One of the side windows was cracked open about 2 or 3 inches. It wasn't wide enough for someone to squeeze through, but it was almost certainly where that voice had drifted in from. Even though the yard was empty, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I shoved the window shut and latched it tight. Then, in the heat of the moment, I did something really stupid. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the front porch. I stayed sheltered under the roof overhang, squinting through the rain. The street was completely deserted. I walked around the muddy flower beds toward that side yard, hoping I'd see footprints in the dirt to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But the torrential rain had turned the whole side yard into a giant mud puddle. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe some drunk guy was walking down the alley yelling on his phone, and I just happened to catch it because the window was cracked. I mean, if someone actually wanted my attention, why wouldn't they just knock on the front door? And how would anyone even know I was awake up in the office? I went back inside, deadbolted the front door, went back upstairs, and forced myself to focus on work. For the next 3 straight hours, everything was completely normal. I finished my movie, switched over to watching random video essays on YouTube, and eventually the adrenaline wore off completely. I figured it had all just been a bizarre fluke. Right around 3:15 a.m., a video ended, and I decided to stand up and stretch my legs. I took my headset off, turned around in my swivel chair, and was just about to get up when my entire body froze in place. I kept my eyes locked on the bottom crack of my closed office door. Cast against the faint light from the hallway, there was a shadow. 2 solid, distinct shapes blocking the light. Someone was standing on the other side of the door. The longer I stared at it, the more horrifyingly real it became, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I hadn't locked the office door. Why would I? I lived alone. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs, I thought the person outside could hear it. I sat trapped in absolute paralysis. If I got up to lock it, the sound of the floorboards would give away that I saw him. But if I just sat there in silence, what was stopping him from turning the handle? For 5 agonizing, endless minutes, the shadow didn't move an inch. He was just standing there, listening to me.
Panic finally overrode my paralysis. I lunged forward out of my chair, sprinted to the door, and slammed the deadbolt into place. The split second that lock clicked, the brass doorknob jiggled violently as he tried to yank it open. When the door didn't budge, he completely lost it. He started hammering on the wood with his fists, rattling the entire frame against the drywall. I stumbled backward into my desk, completely terrified. And then he started screaming. He was screaming my actual first name over and over again at the top of his lungs. He was yelling, "Open the door! Just open the damn door! I need to talk to you! I'll leave you alone! Just open the door!" His voice was disturbingly desperate, furious, and erratic. The terrifying thing was the way he was screaming. It was like he expected me to know him, like we had some unfinished business. But I had never heard this man's voice before in my life. For an entire minute, he violently kicked the base of the door, screaming profanities and demanding I let him in. And then, dead silence. Through the crack at the bottom of the door, I watched his boots stand motionless for another 20 seconds. Then I heard him sprint down the hall, tear down the staircase, and disappear into the night. I locked myself in the corner of that office, clutching a pocket knife, and dialed 911 immediately. Police cruisers arrived within minutes, and I spent the rest of that night giving statements down at the precinct while investigators searched my home. The officers found tool marks on my back patio door. He had expertly picked the deadbolt lock to get inside without making a sound.
but because I couldn't identify the voice and the rain had washed away any tire tracks or footprints outside, the police had zero leads. I never spent another night in that house. I checked into a hotel for a week, packed up my belongings with friends in broad daylight, and broke my lease to move 3 towns over. To this day, I have no idea who that guy was, how long he had been watching me, or how he even knew my name. And the scariest thought I have to live with is knowing that if I haven't locked that office door at that exact second, I probably wouldn't be here to tell this story.
The next story.
This happened almost 5 years ago. It was right at the beginning of summer break after college let out. My parents lived back in Minnesota, and I was going to school out in Boulder, Colorado. Instead of booking a flight back home to stay with them until the fall semester, I made the impulsive decision to turn it into a solo road trip. Honestly, early on into the drive, I was already regretting it. I hate flying, which was the only reason I talked myself into driving in the first place, but the first couple of days were mind-numbingly boring. Just endless flat Midwestern plains and open asphalt. By the third evening, as I was getting closer to Minnesota, the landscape shifted into dense, dark pine forests, and a massive thunderstorm started rolling in. It was torrential downpour, visibility was practically zero, and I still had about 10 hours left on the road. With my eyes burning from fatigue, I decided it was best to pull off somewhere cheap and crash for the night. I pulled over to the shoulder, opened Google Maps, and searched for the nearest motel. It routed me off the main interstate and onto a narrow, bumpy, single-lane back road. I drove for about 20 minutes deep into the trees until I finally saw a sign glowing through the rain. There was just a tiny run-down motel and a little roadside gas station sitting right next to it. That was it. No town, no streetlights, nothing else as far as the eye could see. I wasn't exactly rolling in cash as a college student, so I figured any cheap place with a bed would do. There were 0 other cars in the gravel parking lot, but the neon vacancy sign was flickering, so I pulled in anyway. I sprinted through the rain into the small front lobby. The moment I stepped inside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The lights were on, but they were weirdly dim and humming. The place wasn't staged or maintained like any normal motel lobby. There was no bell on the desk, the furniture looked ripped apart, and the whole room smelled heavily of mold and decay. Except for the dim bulbs overhead, the building looked completely abandoned. Nobody was sitting behind the front desk. I stood there in the silence for about 30 seconds before this overwhelming gut feeling hit me. Get the hell out of here. I felt stupid for even walking in when the lot was empty. I pushed open the door, ran back to my sedan, fired up the engine, and put it in reverse to head back to the main highway. I barely made it 15 seconds down that narrow access road when my car completely died. The engine choked, the headlights shut off, and the entire dashboard went pitch black. I threw the shifter into neutral and coasted onto the muddy shoulder. I turned the key again and again. Nothing. The starter didn't even click. In all the years I had owned that car, it had never once stalled like that. I looked out into the darkness. There was nothing around me except black forest, heavy rain, and about 100 yards behind me, the dull glow of that motel and gas station. Sitting alone in a dead car on an empty road felt completely unsafe. I felt like I had no choice but to walk back toward the lights and find someone with a landline or jumper cables. I grabbed my jacket, stepped out into the pouring rain, and called AAA on my cell.
The dispatcher told me the nearest tow truck was about 45 minutes out. Since I had time to kill, I figured waiting inside the gas station would at least keep me dry. I jogged over to the storefront, grabbed the glass door and pulled. It was locked tight. The lights inside the convenience store were glowing, but the aisles were half empty. The cash register was gone, and there wasn't an employee in sight. A heavy, sick feeling was settling in my gut. With the gas station locked, I walked back over to the motel lobby, hoping that maybe a manager had wandered out to the front desk by now. I pushed the door open. The lobby was still dead quiet. I took a few steps down the narrow hallway that led toward the guest rooms and called out, "Hello? Is anyone here? I need some help with my car." Nothing answered back except the deafening sound of rain pounding on the roof. The longer I stood in that hallway, the more I realized something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just a run-down business, it felt wrong on a primal level. And then, thud. From one of the dark rooms further down the hallway, something heavy slammed violently into the drywall. That was all the warning I needed. I didn't wait to investigate. I turned around, bolted out into the rain, and started jogging back toward my car on the road.
I was halfway down the dark road, maybe 50 feet from my car, when headlights from the distant highway briefly lit up my windshield. Inside the driver's seat of my locked car, a dark figure was moving around. Someone was sitting inside my car. My mind couldn't even process what I was looking at. Before I could move, a sudden instinct told me to look back over my shoulder. Standing in the wide-open doorway of the motel lobby, the exact door I had just sprinted out of, was another man. He wasn't trying to hide. He was just standing under the dim doorway light with his arms at his sides, staring directly down the road at me, watching to see what move I would make next. In that split second, survival instincts took over. This wasn't bad luck, it was an ambush. I didn't think twice. I turned sideways and made a dead sprint into the pitch-black woods off the road. I tore through thorn bushes, tripped over fallen logs, and plunged through deep mud in the dark until the road and the motel lights were completely gone. I crouched behind the trunk of a massive pine tree, soaked and shivering, trying to swallow my own heavy breathing to listen for footsteps. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The dispatcher told me a state trooper was patrolling the highway about 20 minutes away. Those 20 minutes in the dark were the longest minutes of my life. When I finally saw flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the tree canopy, I crawled out of the woods and flagged down the cruiser. By the time the trooper arrived, my car was empty and the motel lobby was dark. Nobody was around. The officer shone his flashlight around the tree line, looked at me and said, "Son, what in the world made you pull off here? You're out of your mind." When the tow truck driver arrived to haul my sedan into the next town over, I sat in the passenger seat and told him the entire story. He didn't look surprised at all. He shook his head and told me that this entire area used to be an old logging town that went belly up decades ago. The motel and gas station had been officially abandoned for years. He explained that hidden behind the motel in the woods were 30 or 40 abandoned, decaying houses that you can't even see from the road in the dark. Squatters and criminals used the power hookups to keep the signs on and lure unsuspecting travelers off the highway.
The most chilling part came the next morning when the mechanics inspected my car. They confirmed that the main ignition harness under the hood had been deliberately tampered with while I had stepped inside the lobby the first time. It was modified so the car would die just far enough down the road that I couldn't drive away. If I hadn't sprinted into those woods the second I spotted those two men, that tow truck driver would have pulled up to an empty car on an abandoned road, and no one ever would have heard from me again.